Welcome to this Authors in Conversation panel featuring two of 2020 Minnesota Book Awards finalists in the competitive genre fiction category. The Minnesota Book Awards is a program of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library in its capacity as the Minnesota Center for the Book. This year's Book Awards are sponsored by Education Minnesota and the genre fiction category through the generosity of Macalester College. I'm Erin Hart, author of a series of crime novels set in St. Paul and in the mysterious bogs of Ireland. Two of my books, Lake of Sorrows and Book of Killowen, were finalists for genre fiction at the Minnesota Book Awards many moons ago. Joining me today are Tracy Lambrecht, better known by her pen name PJ Tracy, author of Ice Cold Heart, published by Crooked Lane Books, and Alan Eskens, author of Nothing More Dangerous, published by Mulholland Books, an imprint of Little Brown and Company. So I have a few questions for you. In the interviews that you did for the 36 finalists blog, you each described your approach to writing. And Tracy, it sounds like when you're deep into it, you attack the story like one of your hacker characters cracking a difficult piece of code. Sleep optional, you said.
Yeah.
And Alan, you have described yourself as a daydreamer. So my question for each of you is how you begin writing. Is there some aha moment when you know you have a kernel of a story that you can turn into a novel? And I'm curious about where you go from there, how you begin constructing that story. Is it a particular scene, setting, bits of dialogue, character sketches? And maybe it's different for each novel you've written. You can talk about that a little bit if you would.
For me, you know, writing the characters is probably the most rewarding and exciting part of writing. I mean, I'm a firm believer in the holy trinity of novels. It's character and plot and setting, but you know, it's like an engine, and all parts have to be working to get down the road. And I think of plot as being the, you know, it's the drive shaft to move things along. It provides purpose and backbone, and you know, setting is obviously atmosphere, but the characters bring such humanity, and I think that resonates with the readers very much, and it certainly resonates with me. So it's, you know, it's such a joy to be able to develop characters and see the evolution. So, you know, that's part of it. As far as the aha moment, okay, every single novel is one long progression of ahas. Totally. I mean, 100%. I mean, there's the first one where, you know, PJ and I always had this litmus test where if we knew we were onto something, if we could both say, hey, wouldn't it be cool if, you know, and that's that's the kernel you speak of. And honestly, I mean, it always surprises me. I just never know. Every morning I can't wake up to see what's going to happen, because it's, and you know, it's so energizing, and I think it helps keep things fresh. So it's, yep, it's aha all the time, and all out war.
Okay. Yes, so as you are aware, I am a daydreamer, and that's what brought me to writing, was wanting to turn my daydreams into stories. And so I will think about a story for usually years before I write it. So right now I'm writing my 7th novel, and I have my 8th novel, my 9th novel, and possibly my 10th novel in my head. I have a sketchbook where I write down my ideas, and as I write down more and more ideas, eventually some just stick with me and they say, you know, I want to be written. And so I'll focus on those more. But when I finish a first draft of a novel, I'm starting on the revisions, I'll start putting a little more focus on the next novel that I'm going to write. And I will daydream about it and think about it for several months. And I'm looking for two things. Number one is, as a mystery writer, I want to write something that has a lot of twists and turns and is cleverly written in terms of the external plot, the mystery or the catching of the villain. But then I put that aside and I think, okay, what is the personal story here? And I think it's when I realize that I have a personal story that's deeper than simply solving the crime, that I realize I have a novel, and those things gel over a matter of time. And then when I get really serious, I get my sketchbook out and I start writing down, you know, notes and asking specific questions. You know, what's the motivation? What are they doing? What's how are they feeling in these scenes. And by the time I finished with all my doodling, I have 50 chapters of plot points laid out and ready to go, and then I'm ready to write.
So it's an interrogation.
It is a percolation. It is just I keep asking myself questions and thinking about the ideas that I have, and the ones that I like best stick. I've always found that even when I was in high school and trying to be creative in theater, my first and second and third ideas were usually something that somebody else has already thought of. And so I realized that when I'm getting to fifth and sixth and seventh levels of ideas, that's where my more creative stuff comes from. So I have to think about it a lot before I sit down to write it.
Interesting process. I'm a little bit more like Tracy. I can't wait to find out what happens because I don't know what happens until I write it down.
I tried that on my first novel, and it took me 20 years or 27 years to write.
Yeah, mine took 16, just thinking for 10 and writing for 6. So now I have specific questions for each of you. Tracy, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the relationships your characters have developed over the Monkey Wrench series. You have 2 cops, Leo Magozzi, am I saying that right? Magozzi, and Gino Rolseth. You have computer genius Grace McBride and her whole Monkey Wrench team. So I wonder what still surprises you about these characters? You've been with them for the whole series. What are you still finding out about them?
They surprise me I can't believe it. I mean, after 10 novels, they are still surprising me. And, I think it's part of having a large ensemble of characters. I mean, you have the cops and you have, the geniuses, and there's usually a tertiary element that's brought into each book. So we have this really dynamic interaction. And, I do write linearly, but as I said before, I can't, I don't plan anything, sit down and wait to see what happens. I mean, it's not quite like that. I'm not totally flying by the seat of my pants, but every interaction engenders a new element that you don't expect. I mean, if character A does this and then character C reacts this way, then how does the relationship evolve? How are they adapting to life? How are they adapting to their new relationship? So, you have an astronomical amount of possibilities of where to go. So I think of it as a big spoke of a wheel, and I'm in the middle and I've got all the stuff out, and you pick a path, and it's just ever evolving. So it's fun, and they really do surprise me. I think probably by page 250 of every book, I'm like, oh my God, what did they do? Why? And then you ask yourself too, it's like, well, this has to be an authentic, genuine reaction, and they have to be real humans. But I mean, they are real to me now. I always tell people, it's like, I get depressed when I don't get Christmas cards from them anymore. So I think, that sort of is part of the relationship. It's like getting to know people, and having 10 books to do it, it is good. It's kind of like, I always think of it as, I like to visualize my process. It helps me. And so I always think of, starting the characters and the relationships as this big sphere of kind of open lace work. And I'm tatting these really fine threads together. And then as the novel or the series progresses, you add more threads and they get tighter and more tightly woven. Hopefully by the end of the book, you will have more like brocade than Venetian lace. And I feel like after 10 books at the end of the series, it's like, I have got a shag rug right now.
Question for you, Alan. You said you started writing Nothing More Dangerous in 1992. That's almost 30 years ago. I had to do the math. Bodhi Sandon is 15-year-old protagonist in this new novel, but we have met him before. He appears in 2 of your previous stories, one as a sort of co-protagonist. Can you talk about how that happened, what it's like to go back to a time of a character that you've written as an adult and to go back to his 15-year-old self?
Well, it's actually the opposite. The 15-year-old was written first. So in 1992, I just gotten out of law school, and I was looking for something to do that would exercise the creative side of me that I developed when I was in theater in high school and early college. And I took, I sat down and wrote a short story about this 15-year-old boy, and I enjoyed writing the story. I'd never written a short story before, or not on purpose. I did it for school, but and so I started studying writing technique and craft to make this story more interesting and better. And this short story then turned into a chapter of a novel. And over 20 years, I worked to make this story better, and took classes, read books, and all that was just for this story, which I then put aside because it wasn't ready and I didn't know why. I wrote my debut novel, got it published, wrote 4 other novels, and felt that now I was ready to go back and revisit this novel I had worked on for 20 years about this 15-year-old boy. But when I wrote my debut novel, The Life We Bury, I was creating this character who was a law professor. And it occurred to me that this 15-year-old boy that I'd been working on for 20 years and this law professor were really aspects of who I was when I was a teenager and who I became after going to law school. And so Bodhi Sandin, the law professor, became Bodhi Sandin from this 15-year-old boy's story because of that connection. So yeah, so I wrote The Life for Barry. He's a minor character in that novel. In The Heavens May Fall, he's a co-protagonist. Again, he's a lawyer and a law professor, but he was already created, and I knew who he was because I'd written this other manuscript that I worked on for 20 years. So that, yeah, so he was created as a 15-year-old first, and then I brought him back to life as an adult.
And did his experiences in this novel, had you any sort of glimmer of his experiences in this novel when you set him up as the character in the others?
Yes. So who he is in this novel, the journey he takes actually forms him as an adult. And if you read my novels with him as an adult and then go back and read Nothing More Dangerous, you will see this progression of him. For example, early on in Nothing More Dangerous, he points out that he's not college material. He's not smart enough to go to college. And he befriends this other boy who, over the course of the novel, gets Bodhi to think, well, maybe I am smart enough to go to college. And that is what changes the course of Bodhi's life. And then when you look at him as an adult, there are things that are like Easter eggs in the 2 novels, mostly in The Heavens May Fall, where as you're reading it, you will, and if you've read Nothing More Dangerous first, and then read The Heavens May Fall, you will see these Easter eggs that go back to his formative years back in Missouri. But they're just little things that I put in there for my own enjoyment. And if a reader sees them,
to reward the readers who really pay attention.
Exactly, yes.
So going back to you, Tracy, Ice Cold Heart involves characters and stories from the Balkans. What was it about that history that made it an important element in this novel?
Well, I was a Russia major. And way back then, in the dark ages, it was still the Cold War. It was still the Soviet Union. So all the satellite nations are, now the independent Balkan nations. So of course, that was part of Russian studies. You're studying the satellites. So I always paid very close attention. And in the early 90s, shortly after I had graduated, is when the Yugoslavian War of Independence, the Balkan Wars began. So I was, obviously paying attention to everything that went on and following it. And the genocide, the atrocities, and the neighbor against neighbor. I mean, it was so horrific. And, it's sad when you study cultures and you love cultures and then you see this happen. So it was always, close to me. And then I kind of felt like, you know what? It's almost like it's disappearing from history. It's never gotten the same. It's just kind of faded away. And I thought that's a really horrible thing because it was a really important time that we should all remember. And so that was part of it. And then the second part of it was I was just reading an article, doing some research, and found out that ICE actually has a special division to find Balkan war criminals who have come here. Back in the 90s, they had an open policy to let in all refugees because it was such a humanitarian crisis. So they were not really questioned. There were no records that they could get of these people. So they were basing it on them telling the truth about who they were. And the war criminals, of course, didn't. And right now, they believe that there are between 300 and 600 war criminals living in the US today, living normal, average, everyday lives and escaped prosecution. And that got me to thinking, wow, what if you have a sociopathic, torturous, war criminal here living a bland, ordinary life? That sociopathic nature doesn't just go away, does it? And that was something that I wanted to explore. So it's kind of a twofold reason for doing it. And good kind of to go back to the old days and doing the research and refreshing and renewing my interest in that region. So.
Right. That reminds me of the quote that kind of underlies everything that I write as well. Past is not dead. It's not even past.
It's right. It's right here, right now. And we're always reliving the same thing over and over. It's so cyclical. Yeah. So, it's here and now.
Yeah. It may have faded from the headlines, but it stays with the people.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Alan, question for you. I wondered if you could talk about creating a place. Bodie's home is Jessup, Missouri, and it's a small town that's full of secrets. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So when I was writing this story as a short story, I didn't understand the whole hero's journey aspect of writing. And one of the first books I read was Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces. And I realized that Bodie, my young protagonist, had to have a journey. And over the course of the 20 when I was involved, the journey that I knew Bodie had to take was one that I had taken. It was a journey of coming to understand my own subconscious prejudices. So growing up, reading To Kill a Mockingbird, I would say, well, that's not me. I don't believe in Jim Crow laws. I don't believe people should drink out of different fountains. So therefore, I'm not prejudiced. I'm not racist. But then as I became more educated, more enlightened, met more people, I realized that the world that I lived in growing up in Missouri, I had very, very strong prejudices that I didn't realize that I had. They were subconscious, they were latent, they were hidden inside me. And looking back on who I was when I was 15, it took me a decade of going through college and law school and stuff to come to understand why I felt the way I felt and why I thought the way I thought. And so I wanted to create a world where Bodie grew up thinking that his own prejudices were not prejudices at all. There's a quote, there's a passage in the novel where he's talking to his neighbor, an older gentleman named Hoke, and he says, I'm not prejudiced. I think that blacks can be just as good as whites if they try hard enough. And so that's the starting point. And then so I created a society, Jessup, Missouri, a fictional town, where Bodie can live inside that world and think the way he thinks and think it's perfectly normal. But then when a black family moves in across the road and he befriends their son, he begins to see the world differently. And so the whole point of creating Jessup was to create different catalysts for Bodie coming to look at himself and the way he thinks differently.
That's something my sister maintains, is the whole reason we read fiction is to get into other people's heads.
Definitely.
That is a true story.
There's just too much to know about things. There's just so much. So you want to get into everybody's head. And I think, fiction really enables you to do that on a much more personal level than say, okay, I'm reading about, this town or this place or this culture or something, but actually experiencing it through the eyes of the people who are that or who have lived that is just,
right.
It's part of the magic, I think. Part of the magic of writing and reading.
Yeah.
I agree. I think that, my perspective, I couldn't write a story about a young Black man or a young woman growing up and the travails that they would experience, but I can tell the story of a young white boy who has certain opinions and needs to explore those. And so people who don't have my experience, when they read my book, they can put themselves in the shoes of someone like me.
Right. And how he begins to see the world through other people's eyes.
Yes.
His friendships and relationships in the town. Yeah. Yeah. Let me ask you about genre fiction. If that was always your ambition to be crime writers, or if I know, Alan, you said this is your most literary novel, but I maintain that literary novels and genre novels are not mutually exclusive.
That's right.
I completely agree. Actually, I think there was among the many, many books on writing technique that I read, Donald Moss, I think it was 21st Century Fiction, points that out. He said that, there was a time in the 40s and 50s where there was a very strong crime genre type of format. But now you look at crime fiction and it is merging. No Country for Old Men, Cormac McCarthy. That is really a thriller, but it is written so well. It is a literary novel. When you look at what makes a literary novel, in my opinion, it's elevated prose, of course, but it's also having deeper themes. And a lot of today's, what they call genre fiction or commercial fiction, has very deep themes. My own personal view is I'm writing the mystery aspect of my novel as a vehicle to tell the personal story. And the personal story to me is always more important than the mystery. But I want to make each strong enough that they could each be their own novel, but then I weave them together into a single story.
Mm-hmm. Tracy, how about you? Did you always set out to become a crime writer, genre fiction writer?
No, I didn't. I mean, I started writing from the time I could hold a crayon, basically, and PJ was a writer. So I just knew I knew that I wanted to be a writer. I knew also that I had to be a writer. I had no choice. And that became evident really early on in my life. And I just wanted to write. And I knew that the more I wrote, the better I'd get. I mean, I think you see a lot of young writers who think that, at 24, they're going to write the great American novel and get very angry when it gets rejected. But I was a lot more humble, and I knew that it took a lot of experience and a lot of work to do it. So I didn't so much pay attention to what. I did poetry, I did short stories. PJ and I started writing together doing romance and short fiction. And then it became, all right, I love to do this. Can I make a living at it and do what I love? And that's where the romance came in. And we found out, yes, we can make a great living at it. So we wrote Harlequins together for years. We did screenplays, another genre I really enjoy writing in. But PJ and I mean, obviously, if you're writing a very limited, when you're writing for Harlequin, you have a girl and a boy and a conflict and a happy ending. And I love romance, but it was very strict. You're really boxed in. And when we try to do a secondary character, they'd say, no, you can't have a secondary character, or you can't have atmosphere, or, it's just, so we got really, really burned out. And PJ and I both adored mysteries and thrillers our whole lives. I mean, I read The Shining when I was 10, and I was like, over the moon. We both loved it. So I thought, why don't we take a year off and write what we love to read? And that's sort of how Monkey Wrench came into it. And, I think if you write what you love, you're going to have success doing it, because it bleeds through. There's a joy inherent in that. Yeah.
I remember an editor asking me if I had ever thought about just writing literary fiction. And, while I'm saying, yes, of course, inside my head, the voice was asking, if no one is murdered, what do the people do?
Isn't that funny? But, Alan, your books and my books, they're obviously, there's thrillers, there's murder and stuff. But I really believe that if you do take out like the murder part, you still have a really rich tapestry of things. They do something else. They wouldn't solve a murder. Maybe, I don't know what they would do, but and that kind of goes back to what I was talking about, how important all the components of the plot setting and characters are, but how really the characters are the most important. They're all important, but they're so important because they drive everything. They drive the humanity. They create the plot as you go along, and they're really they can change on a dime. If you have a plot, it's not it changes, but it can't. It's kind of a static thing. So it's just it's so important to just view it in that way and enjoy it, appreciate it for what it is.
When readers ask you when's the next one coming out, they're not asking about when's the next murder going to happen. They are asking about what's happening with the characters.
Because they care, right? And that's one of the greatest things as a writer, when you hear somebody say, I can relate to that character, or that reminded me of something, or that helped me through a hard time because I totally understood. And that's like, wow, I'm here as an entertainer, but if I touch somebody, that's like the greatest thing in my life.
Right.
Yeah, Leo Tolstoy once said that the whole purpose of art is to communicate to others the deepest feelings of humankind. That's a paraphrase, but so when somebody writes me an email and saying they have tears on their cheeks after reading my book, it's not because of the twists and turns. It's because I've introduced them to a character that they've come to feel and have empathy for, and step into that character's shoes. And then when something sad happens, that transfers the emotion to the reader. And that's really what I love about being a writer, is if I'm able to evoke emotion, that's more important than anything else.
It's the greatest accomplishment, I think, as a writer.
Right. Let me ask you a little bit about, it's a thing that I call method writing. You've heard of method acting, where you live the part. Do you act out any elements of your story, or do you feel like you're there with the character? That kind of experience.
You go first, Ellen. I'm not going to talk about my acting out.
Absolutely. I will write a scene, and I will stand in the shoes of one character in the scene. Then when I go through and I'm doing revisions, I will stand in the shoes of another character in the scene, because if I am looking at the scene just from one character's perspective, it's going to play out a certain way, but the supporting character is just going to be kind of a wall to bounce things off of. But if you step into that character's persona, their shoes, understand what drives them, what is their fears, what are their motivations, what do they desire, it changes that character within the scene. And so in Nothing More Dangerous, for example, in the first draft, one of the parts of the story takes place in this high school, and there's this, for lack of a better term, a bully named Jarvis, and he has two friends who are, for lack of another better term, henchmen. They're his buddies. They will do his bidding. First draft, they were interchangeable. When I went back and rewrote it, first thing I did was I asked myself, what do they want? What is their desire? What are their fears? And it changed who they were. So then when I rewrote this story, they had their own perspectives within the scene. And it just made for a so much better story. So yeah, I stand in as many characters' shoes as I can as I'm running a scene, and go back over and over and over to rewrite it to say, well, this person from this protagonist's point of view would say this, but from their point of view, they would say something different. So yeah, I'm as a daydreamer, I'm inside my characters constantly.
Yeah, I really think you have to be. I mean, there's no way that you can produce an authentic character people care about without being in, stepping into their shoes, not literally. And I don't act out, but I do act out literally. PJ and I did when writing screenplays, and that's really helpful because it helps with dialogue and so forth. But I often kind of think I have like a minor multiple personality disorder, because I have like this switch in my head. I'm like, I'm the cops right now. And then I do the cop thing, and then, turn around and there's a whole new face. So I have these compartments in my head that I can like go back and forth and be different people, which might sound really ill. I don't know, but it's kind of fun. You know, I'm always entertained. I mean, during this quarantine, I have so many imaginary friends.